Good afternoon. Welcome to this IEDC webinar. I'm Joshua Wright from Emsi, and I'm excited to be joined by Josh Bays and Chris Schwinden of Site Selection Group to share insights and tips on telling an effective story with data in general and workforce data in particular. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. Please note that all attendees will be muted during the webinar. Also, to ask a question to the speakers, please type your questions into the question box. We will have a Q&A period at the end. And within 24 hours of this webinar, an evaluation will be emailed to you by IEDC. If you can, please complete that evaluation as IEDC uses that feedback to improve your webinars. At the end of this evaluation, you'll receive a link to download the presentation as well. So you'll have the slides. With that, I want to introduce Josh and Chris. Josh Bays is a partner at Site Selection Group, where he leads the company's industrial practice. Throughout his career, Bays has developed various cutting-edge analytical platforms that have enabled clients to optimize their location decisions. In addition, he is a critical part of the company's executive team and helps provide and implement strategic direction for Site Selection Group. Prior to being at SSG, Bays worked at Trammell Crow Company, where he was an integral part of the company's corporate site selection team. And although Bays' technical background is rooted in the field of GIS, Geographic Information Sciences, he is considered an expert in industrial site selection, where he integrates real estate and economic incentive strategies for the company's industrial clients. Bays has completed more than 750 projects for global clients. That list includes Adidas, Amazon.com, Bimbo Bakeries, Boeing, Harley-Davidson, Papa John's, and Wright. Josh received his MBA from the University of Texas at Austin. He holds a bachelor's degree in geography with concentrations in urban geography and geographic information science, also from UT Austin. And he is a licensed real estate salesman in the state of Texas. So that's Josh. Also with us is Chris Schwinden. He's a vice president of Site Selection Group, where he supports the company's industrial site selection and economic development consulting projects. Chris has extensive background providing advanced analytics in the economic development industry, provides Site Selection Group clients invaluable perspective as he evaluates critical location drivers such as workforce characteristics, business environment, transportation, logistics, economic incentives, climate, and real estate conditions. Prior to joining Site Selection Group, Chris was a senior research analyst at the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina. And while there, he completed numerous labor market and cost analyses and built robust competitiveness models to identify specific industry clusters and firm recruitment to and firms for recruitment to the state. Chris also worked at the North Carolina Department of Commerce, where he produced economic and fiscal impact analyses for the state's major incentive programs. We're very excited to have both Josh and Chris and hear from them. They have a lot of expertise and years of experience in economic development and site selection. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Josh to talk a little bit about a Site Selection Group as a firm.
Yep, thanks, Josh. So Site Selection Group, as the name suggests, it's certainly not a deceptive name. We are a corporate site selection firm. When you think of Site Selection Group, think of us as providing three fundamental services to corporate clients. The first service is location consulting. So that's all of the analytics and strategy that goes behind making sure our clients are locating in the optimal location for whatever it is that drives their business. And we'll talk about some of those business drivers here in a little bit. In addition to the location consulting, Site Selection Group also offers a full slate of economic incentive services. So identifying, negotiating, and securing economic incentives on behalf of our clients and helping with ongoing compliance. And then much like incentives, the third service that we offer is a full slate of real estate services, identifying, negotiating, and securing real estate. So a typical project for us, it requires us to integrate all of those into kind of one seamless process. With regard to the company itself, we're headquartered in Dallas. We have 35 full-time employees. We have a branch office in New York, Greenville, South Carolina, and Austin, Texas. We do roughly about 100 projects a year. And of those projects, from a project profile perspective, roughly half of our projects are what we call professional service in nature. So things like corporate headquarters, call center, back office, shared service type projects. The other half of our projects are industrial, so any type of production and or distribution related activity.
Great. Thanks for that, Josh. And now just a quick word about Emsi here. Emsi's mission is to help communities prosper, and we do this by providing unparalleled data, strategies, and training to our clients. Our labor and economic analytics are used by over 350 economic development organizations and workforce development organizations, including more than half the state EDOs out in the country and 80% of the large metros, and also many smaller rural communities for which this data is so hard to find. We also provide actionable talent analytics to hundreds of colleges and universities, a growing list of Fortune 50 and Fortune 500 companies, and the largest site selection and commercial real estate firms in the nation. Members of the Council for Community and Economic Research, which goes by C2ER, ranked Emsi as their #1 information resource in 2018, a distinction that we are particularly proud of. And with our consulting, customer training, and partnerships with organizations like Site Selection Group, we strive to get behind the why of the labor and economic data that we offer. So that's just a little bit about Emsi and a little bit about Site Selection Group. Now we want to pivot to set the stage for today's presentation and talk. So first, again, to set that stage, we live really in the data age. Just as we are fully in the knowledge economy, the human capital economy, we're also in a data-driven economy. And as the use of this data, really data of all kinds of types, has exploded, businesses and site selection consultants are becoming increasingly savvy data consumers and data aggregators, I should note. So IEDC has done a really nice job emphasizing this in a number of different reports, one of which came out in 2016 entitled A New Data Standard. As they mentioned, businesses and consultants can locate data faster through platforms like Emsi's and the BLS, rather than going straight to your economic development office. They especially can find your unemployment rate, broad industry sector data, other big picture metrics very quickly. That data is readily available. So where do you and your community or region fit in? Again, here's a section of that report from IEDC called the New Data Standard. You are tasked, you as a community or region are tasked with telling your community's unique story because you know it better than anyone. It could be a niche industry cluster or a concentration of a specific type of talent that isn't readily apparent in the data, or a stellar partnership of workforce education providers. What are your comparative advantages, and how do you use those advantages? How do those advantages fall in line with your target industries and your overall strengths? That's what we want to talk about today, and what I think is something important to consider. So, just a quick thing of what we'll cover. Quick few topics here. We're going to get into what data businesses want to see and how they want to see it displayed, the top metrics and factors to best assess the workforce in particular, and we're going to get into that effective data storytelling, as I just mentioned. With that as a table setter, I want to turn it to Josh now, who's going to talk about the importance and evolution of workforce analytics and how it impacts the site selection process.
Yep, appreciate it. So when we talk about what businesses are looking for, one of the most common questions we get from economic development is, what do you see driving projects today? What are those project drivers that are influencing companies' location decisions? And on the next slide here, I believe we've got a list here. So when you look at these metrics, to the extent anything's typical, right? Every project's unique, and if we leave you with anything today, that's probably the theme, is every project's unique, and these metrics are rank ordered differently for each particular project. But if you're asking us to paint with a very broad brush on what are driving projects, this list on the left is directionally correct in its order. So you have things like workforce, and then specifically for industrial projects, transportation and infrastructure, accessibility, business and tax, climate, et cetera, et cetera. But what the list on the left does not show you is the order of magnitude of these. In our experience, whether it's professional service type projects, whether it's industrial, the one common theme to all of our projects is the availability of a qualified workforce is typically the biggest location driver. And there's a substantial drop-off before you get to that secondary, whatever that secondary location driver is. One interesting trend that we've seen, especially as the workforce is tight, and it's tight everywhere. Almost everybody that's participating in this webinar is probably experiencing some workforce challenge or another. But as the workforce has gotten more and more and more tight, companies have become a little bit less sensitive to the delta in cost between one market to another. And so when we talk about workforce and site selection, and my colleague Chris addresses workforce analytics in more detail, it's going to be shaped more around the availability of a qualified workforce. So obviously demonstrating workforce is key on that previous slide. Want to kind of frame up how workforce is used in the site selection process. If you look at the top gray bars here, you'll notice there are kind of 6 phases, and I'm sure the majority of you are familiar with the site selection process in some form or fashion, but this is a process most companies use. Starting off with a needs assessment, you start with some very large geographic consideration. You apply a series of analyses and filters until you eliminate options along the way until the most competitive option is selected. Now, while I severely oversimplified that process, it is a top-down approach. You start with a lot, you apply a series of analyses and filters, you see what comes out the other end of that hopper. The thing that is typically, or the aspect that is typically present throughout this entire process, at least from community filtering all the way until companies are conducting site visits and starting to make location decisions, is the presence of workforce analytics in some context. But that type of analytics changes as you navigate this process. Earlier in the process, companies, consultants, and other vendors that companies might be using for location decisions typically rely more on what we call secondary research. Those are the research that Josh was referring to, and he talked about things like EMSI, BLS, et cetera, because it's important at that phase that you have standardized data across a variety of geographies. But as that filter gets, or that funnel gets more and more constrained, and you're narrowing the field of options that you're considering, and workforce analytics becomes more in depth as that happens, the type of workforce data quickly shifts to primary research. And the way that we define primary research is that research that you're gathering from on-the-ground resources that you can't find in a database, whether that's employer sentiments, whether that's workforce sentiments, whether that's all kinds of anecdotal information about workforce development and workforce training ecosystems, et cetera. I'll ask my colleague Chris to chime in here. Chris, is there anything else that you think is important?
Sure. That kind of bottom line there where we talk about filtering risk versus selection risk is just kind of another way of portraying how we look at this. So if we're looking nationally at every metro and micro across the country, we're leveraging that secondary data to help filter down from 935 down to 10 or 15 or 20. So as a result, if your community doesn't align with project requirements in terms of whether it's demographics or population size or population growth or concentration of welders or programmers, that's where you've got that filtering risk of you could fall out of a project before you even know it exists. But on the flip side of that is leveraging that information. So if you know that your community, your metro, your micro, your region looks really well from that secondary data perspective, there are certain strengths that exist there. That's where you can kind of leverage that data to lift up your profile further. Sort of the flip side, as Josh was saying, on the primary research side, it goes to more of kind of a selection risk, but a storytelling advantage. On the selection risk, it's when you get into primary data, and when a good conversation or a bad conversation with a technical school or a bunch of employers in a community can either help you get deselected from a project, but also that positive storytelling can get you included all the way down to the finalists and hopefully winning a project. So that's how we sum up kind of how this view on secondary research versus primary research.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josh and Chris. And I think that framework is really a nice way to look at it, and especially like, that going from secondary to primary and the filtering risk kind of whole lens is something that is just, again, a very helpful lens to kind of put this through. For this next section, we wanted to talk about the number one question for every business, the key question, and hit on the data that's often relevant, or always, or very often relevant, but overlooked. And for that, I want to hand it to Chris specifically here.
Sure, and as you see there on that title slide, I mean, that's the challenge right now, and it is a challenge for basically every type of project. And we're sort of joking on whether you're hiring 5 or 500 people, but it's hard. It's hard in the tightest labor market that we've been in decades, and perhaps since basically World War II. So when we're doing our work, when we're working with clients, how do we help them answer that question of how are you going to find workforce? There's a kind of a couple ways that we look at this as you see on the side. Those first 5 bullets you see on the left, we'll talk through those, and it's sort of analogous to that figure you see on the right. But kind of really boiling this down to how do you answer that question to give a company confidence that they're going to be able to hire, retain, and grow their workforce? So answering that question, the first set of data comes to location. Where are workers, essentially? That's commuting patterns, that's counting rooftops, that's demographic indicators, and so forth. It's just where is the workforce physically in this community and relative to this site, this building, this office we're looking at. That second point, labor growth or decline, at the end of the day, we do a lot of different advanced kind of demographic work and occupational work, and Emsi does a great job with a lot of their tools and so forth. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, does a company have confidence that the demographics are aligned with needs in a community, and in the long run, whether that's 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, or 50 years, is the demographic and kind of occupational makeup of a community aligned with what they're looking for? That third one is skills baseline. So that's, if you need to hire a lot of welders or a lot of computer programmers, you may not necessarily go to the market that has the most or the highest concentration of those, but do the skill sets, do the occupational types that exist in that market, are they generally aligned with your goals? The fourth point, competition, and one thing that we like about what Emsi and some other data sources are producing is more robust data on understanding the competitive framework that exists in markets. Basically, if I need to hire a bunch of machinists, who else in this community, in this region, is also hiring those machinists, and what does it take to compete with those folks for workforce? And then finally, that future pipeline. This is oftentimes the hardest one to put data around, and we'll talk a little bit about this going forward, but does a company have confidence that the K-12 educational system, the technical training 4-year, all those educational institutions are working together to produce that skilled workforce going forward? So if we're going to really boil it down, it's those 5 points. Now, setting the stage, and something that we get a lot of questions about, we'll discuss this in detail as we move forward here, is understanding from an economic development perspective, what's the type of data that we, site selectors or other types of consultants, are looking for. So we just want to set the stage here, and the first is that although we would like to think that we represent a lot of projects out there, there's plenty of projects that are company-led and may not be as familiar with this type of data that Josh was describing earlier, and may not know how to go to BLS or Emsi or those types of sources to get that type of information, versus the consultant side of folks who are generally pretty familiar with those resources. So from an EDO perspective, it's depending on who you're talking to, how are you going to design your data, your responses, and so forth, depending on who the audience is. With that, I think we can move on to the next slide, unless Josh have any comments.
One quick question from me, Chris, on that. When you spoke specifically of competition and looking at the competitive landscape, you're referring to looking at job posting analytics specifically to see what kind of the postings are looked by employer and how and the kind of what positions the demand on the demand side they're looking at. Is that right?
Yep, that's exactly right, and that's a perfect tee up for what we have here. And it's one of those really good examples of, and there's probably a better way to term it, but non-traditional data that's not fundamentally produced by census or BLS or a government resource, but and moves much more quickly, is much more powerful, can be a little bit more raw sometimes, but can help uncover those type of competitive dynamics. So perfect tee up, Josh, for this slide. So this is a question we get all the time, and why we wanted to discuss this here is data that's either overlooked, misunderstood, those types of things. And we're highlighting a few things here that we think are particularly important, things that we use on our side, things that providers like Emsi either provide or are working hard to build their databases to be able to do this, and types of information that communities can provide to folks like us or companies or other consultants to help lift up their communities. That first one, where workers live versus where they work. This is a nice feature in Emsi and in other resources too, of both showing that data of where people are employed and where people live, and being able to slice and dice that data by SOC code and other sources. Even if you don't have subscription data sources, publicly available data like on the map and loads, that type of data, which drives a lot of the data that Emsi and other folks produce, is really valuable to show those commuting flows, and for folks working in a particular geography or a business park or a city, where those folks actually live, and getting a sense of commuting patterns. That second bullet there, skills, detail, and data by job title. This is always one, and I hope Josh at Emsi can chime in here to say if they've got some new fantastic solution on this. But I think a lot of folks are familiar with the SOC codes. We use them. A lot of people use them. It's a fundamental way to organize counting welders versus programmers versus machinists versus electrical engineers versus all those types of skill sets. What's always a challenge for us is going beyond the codes, going beyond what those SOC descriptions provide. So the example is always on computer programmers, and that type of technical skill set is understanding what the supply of people with a specific programming language or specific skill set to go beyond the code. So someone with Java experience or Ruby or something like that. We've got the same issue on the industrial side of how do you find folks with specific kind of welding skills above and beyond what gets captured by the SOC code. There's no really great solution on this, so it's data that oftentimes can get produced or understood by communities and lifted up to say, well, actually, in our welding workforce, we've got a lot of folks who had this particular skill set and so forth. On another challenge is always specific compensation metrics. There's a number of sources out there of Emsi and BLS data and other folks that provide pretty good quality data on wage and salary, but especially in this labor market, and especially when you've got the Amazons of the world who are announcing all of a sudden $15 an hour for a warehouse associate, it's really tough to find real-time accurate wage and salary data, especially for those types of entry-level positions. There's no good SOC code for just a warehouse associate or an entry-level machine operator. As a result, one thing the communities can do really well is either through a labor study or surveying or working with staffing agencies is understand the real-time, real market wages for key occupations. Underemployment is another thing that comes up time and time again. For folks who are less familiar with the phrase, it's simply a measure of folks who are employed but are not utilized to their full capability. That could be part-time workers who would prefer full-time work, non-permanent workers, folks working in temp jobs, for example, who would prefer a permanent position, and those who are overqualified for their job. We've seen some communities invest some time and money in doing these types of exercises to estimate underemployment, and data providers providing this type of information as well. And it can point to data beyond just the straight unemployment rates that can be really useful to find that little bit of slack in a market that may be helpful for our clients. Demand metrics, as Josh was saying just a moment ago, fundamentally this is job postings data. This is providers like Emsi, Burning Glass, other folks who are able to scrape job postings, to summarize job postings, to say what are the types of positions that are really in demand because they're posted on job boards and so forth. This is something that we use all the time in order to estimate who are our clients going to compete with if they're going to locate in community A versus community B, and what does relative demand look like across those markets. So these are just summarizing some specific data sources and types of things that we use all the time. Folks like Emsi and other providers are able to produce, or at least are pushing that way, and we find invaluable in the site selection process.
Great. A couple follow-ups to that, Chris, just from the Emsi perspective here. You mentioned the skills data in detail beyond the SOC code, and that's something that we know our clients have felt the pain for a number of years, and we were excited just a couple years ago to release a online social profile resume database where you can search by Java, by cybersecurity, other things that aren't in the SOC system or in the industry NAICS code system, and be able to get a sense of what the supply is for those. So that's something that many of our economic development organizations that work with us are using that data, and many of them used it in their Amazon HQ2 proposals as well. And also something that we're working on there is our data scientists we've done a number of studies that you can find on our blog or website around skills clustering, how skills cluster in data science and manufacturing, and kind of more of an organic process to see how skills group together and without the confines or the construct of SOC codes or ONET codes. And that's been really interesting research that's going to help us inform how we can help our clients look at individualized career pathways and other things like that. On the compensation side, just wanted to make a quick mention of, I think that's a great point about the pain about real-time comp data or comp data that goes beyond just median hourly wages by occupation, that type of a thing. And that's something that we'll recombine that resume and social profile data with the rigorous data from government sources like Census Bureau and BLS to provide what the comp looks like when you add a skill to a worker or by an occupation and by job title. And that data is also being utilized quite a bit, and we're doing more on that side as well. And as well as continuing to push on our job posting analytics and underemployment and other things like that. So I think this is a really excellent list. And to move on to the next topic we wanted to cover is really pivoting to how do you evaluate softer variables, specifically workforce training and development programs. And Chris, I know you guys have quite a bit of experience on the ground, working on the ground in communities and what's working and what's not working from that perspective.
Yep, and this is a great tee up for this conversation, and I'd like to say that we've got some type of absolutely secret sauce that we've got to figure out exactly how to evaluate workforce training and development resources through that corporate lens, but it's tough. It's a really tough thing to quantify, but leading off of Josh Bays' comment a little bit earlier, when we're talking about kind of workforce being that big bucket or one of the most important, if not the most important site selection drivers, right now workforce training, I would argue, is probably 1A on that list, because there's not a whole lot of folks sitting on the sidelines. So what are local educational institutions doing to address that, even though solutions and that pipeline might not get developed tomorrow, but what are they doing in the long run? So on this slide, you see kind of 4 buckets: middle school, high school, technical and community training, and colleges and universities. And we've broadly highlighted the types of things that, especially when we're on the ground with clients, doing interviews with employers, doing interviews with training facilities, with economic development leaders and so forth. These are the types of things that we're looking for. And it's tough to quantify and put numbers behind any of this. Obviously, you can use the IPEDS data or IPEDS through Emsi to count how many welding completions or industrial engineers are coming out of State U. But this is where that storytelling becomes really, really important on how all these folks work together. So to those 3 bullets on the top, number 1 thing we often look for is business and institutional collaboration. So when we're interviewing local employers, does it sound like they're using training resources in the community? What do they think? Are they lukewarm on it? Are they kind of the head cheerleader on saying that our local technical school is doing absolutely everything it can to help meet ours and our competitors' workforce needs? Again, tough to put a number on that, but it's really, really important. That second point, training ladders and institutional coordination. And we've seen more and more shifts of communities getting ahead in terms of stackable credentials, stackable short-term credentials, rather than more traditional 2- and 4-year degrees. But what our clients and corporate folks are oftentimes looking for is, they don't care where the skill comes from, whether it comes in a certificate form or a degree form. They just need that skill in the community and want to know how to grow that. So if it happens at high school and then goes into a technical training program and then can go into a 4-year program or a program through a 4-year institution, that's really, really fantastic to see. That final bullet there of how do you merge that quantitative data, that completion data or enrollment data with on the ground storytelling. And the best communities that we see on this front are able to merge both of those to tell a story. Oftentimes it takes the form of, we realized in this community that we had a distinct lack of supply of a certain occupation type. I always use welders, but welders, machinists, computer programmers, nurses, what have you. So all these educational institutions worked together and figured out how to address that pipeline, worked with employers to understand their needs, and now look at how that comes out in the data. We're finally seeing it in the data, in the completion data, whether it's a certificate or a degree or whatever. That's where the data really gives power to the story. So again, it's a tough thing to measure here on workforce development and training quality, but man, it's really, really, really important right now.
That's very cool. And I wonder, Chris, are you guys, a couple of follow-up questions on that. Are you guys seeing, I know there's been a kind of an explosion of different communities putting talent attraction websites together, or, you know, obviously that's more on the talent side, but even on the business side, like either examples of how this can be displayed, how these types of partnerships and innovative training programs can be marketed. And another question is, you know, is there any communities or states you think that are doing this particularly well right now?
So on the first question, again, I sort of alluded to this in my rambling from earlier, but oftentimes I think that the story comes best from the mouth of employers, whether that's operation folks or the CEO or someone, because communities do a really great job of tooting their own horn and showing that they're a great community and they've got those resources and so forth. But it's when that comes through to employers, and an existing employer telling one of our clients or another locationally active company that, yeah, the community's saying this, but we believe it, we use it, and we want you to be in this community as well, future competitor, because you're going to only make our community stronger and build these programs. So that's why I say it's really important for us to hear that and our clients to hear that when we're on the ground. And I do think that those types of ways of delivering that message, whether through a website or videos or that kind of stuff, is the words of employers, however you want to lift that up, is really important. What was the second?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here because the question's actually a really good one, and the answer to that's probably a frustrating answer, honestly, because communities here, the best way to get that word out is through our employers, but it's tough to do that in mass. It's tough to reach a broad audience with that. And so how can you reach a broad audience from a messaging perspective? And I think Chris is right. However you do it, it's got to incorporate your employers, whether it's video testimonials, that can be on a website, that can be in promotional pieces, whether it's logos of companies that leverage your workforce development ecosystem in some form or fashion. You know, logos of companies is something that I think sometimes resonates with companies probably more than it should, but anything you can do to demonstrate that companies are actually using the training ecosystem, because the one thing, it's funny, Chris and I will be conducting a site visit and we'll go see this fabulous training institution with all of these capabilities and all of these different and relevant programmatic offerings. And then we'll leave there and we'll go interview 5 or 6 employers right after the fact. And you ask them, you know, what are your experiences with the training capabilities? Oh, it's phenomenal. They've got great facilities. Well, do you use it? No, we really haven't got around to using it. And it's one of the most frustrating things as an outsider, and I'm sure it's frustrating with communities as well. And so as you're marketing it, just encourage you to try to close that gap, because that's something not a lot of folks do well.
Yeah, very cool. And Chris, the second question was more of, you know, you don't have to highlight any specifics, excuse me, if you'd rather not. But I was wondering if there's any communities or regions or states that really jump out to you guys who are doing a good job with this type of workforce training programs or partnerships that seem to stand out to you all.
Yeah, so I'll answer that in this way, where especially with Josh and my bias towards the industrial side, for a long time the Southeast United States is I think still the premier kind of market in terms of workforce training, whether that's programs at the middle school and high school level, technical training, and so forth. The nice thing that's happening around the country right now is that we see more and more communities all over the place, whether in the Midwest, the Northeast, the Western U.S., are picking up on the importance of investing in workforce training, especially at the community and technical college level. So you see more folks doing it, learning from what the Southeast has done for a long time. And that's a really good thing for everyone.
Sure. And we are going to have a Q&A for the audience. Just if you joined us late, we will have a Q&A at the end. But actually, we just got a question that I think fits really well right here into this discussion, and one that I'm also interested in is that question is: are work keys, whether gold, silver, bronze numbers, valued by employers in this regard?
You know, that's a really, really good question. And we get that from time to time. So the answer in my humble view is it matters if the majority of your employers in your market say that it matters. We've been in, and I know that's very circular, but what we're trying to say is that if you're trying to promote that you're a work keys community, or that X number of folks have bronze, silver, gold certifications or whatever, that's really good and important. But again, it goes back to that previous point of, if employers, existing employers in the market, are the ones who are saying, yes, we use work keys, yes, we believe in it, that gives more and more kind of confidence to a new employer or one who's looking at your community to say, okay, this is actually something that's important to me because everyone in this market is using it. That being said, I think there's a lot of still kind of uncertainty from most corporate clients on, as we say on kind of the site certification side, we've never had a client come and say, we absolutely need a certified site. I don't think we've ever had a client say that we need an XYZ certified workforce community, but is that marketing and substantive designation gets adopted by more and more employers, both nationally and in specific communities, I think it's going to become more important. But it's totally contingent on whether your local employers are utilizing it and believing in it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good response. And I was at the latest IEDC annual conference in Atlanta just a month or two ago. I was on a panel with ACT talking about their work keys and within a community in the southeast region of North Carolina, and who have used work keys to great effect in terms of expanding their workforce, kind of marketing their workforce and what they have. So I do think that I agree. I mean, it's certainly valuable, but it really depends on the project and how it's being deployed. We want to pivot next to effective storytelling and using data in that regard. And so I'm going to push it back to Chris here, and hoping you can talk specifically about some factors that communities should consider when it comes to telling their story, and then how to tell that story as well.
Yep. And we'll run through a few kind of key bullets here, things that we try to do, things that we see that economic development organizations do well when they're doing that, either 10 or a 30-minute spiel in front of us and in front of a client when we're on the ground. So let's take a look at those bullets, and we'll walk through these pretty quickly. So the first is providing context and making it comparative. So that's putting your population growth up against your competitors and regional competitors or national competitors and showing that your community is better. Data always stands out better when it's put in a comparative framework. So saying that you've got a 4% unemployment rate is tough for companies to understand if that's not put in context. We put with real comparisons there because while sometimes putting things in comparison to a national average or a state average or the Southeast or the Midwest is important, what's oftentimes more important is putting that in context against the types of communities that your community is likely to be competing with. So if you're in Dallas here, putting that in context against Nashville or Atlanta or Oklahoma City and so forth. Maps are always a favorite for clients, both for just straight up orienting folks to where they are, because especially if you're doing a road trip with Site Selection Group, you're seeing a lot of markets in a short period of time. So putting some good maps together and simple maps that show where these sites are, where these buildings are, where people are in terms of worker availability and so forth. Some good maps are always good in a presentation and telling your workforce story. That third point, political boundaries versus when to use points. And this is something that's also gotten easier with Emsi and other sources as well. What can be frustrating sometimes is if we're in a community and we're looking at a particular piece of dirt or a building, providing data statistics for the county or the MSA, instead of dropping a pin on that building and saying within 30 minutes or 35 or 40 minutes, there's this many people, there's this many computer programmers, these are what average markets are for this particular labor shed. So sometimes there's a role for especially community introductions on welcome to our city, welcome to our county, or welcome to our region, but where possible, especially if you have prior knowledge, dropping a pin on the map and providing detailed data on those particular points. That fourth point of data over time, this is, again, it's an opportunity to show growth, an opportunity to better tell your story. For example, one thing that we see from time to time in communities, they'll lift up the number of whatever educational completions, whether that's marketing folks or engineers or or something like that, but tells a stronger story if you can show that trend going up. Instead of saying we had 12 welding completions in 2017, it looks better, even if 12 is a small number, if there were 6 in the year before and 0 in the year prior to that. When the data lies, this is always a challenge, especially when it comes to wage data, but there's other times where we've seen communities have challenges when off-the-shelf secondary data doesn't tell the whole story. So there's some strategic ways of getting ahead of, if you know that something isn't quite right on the secondary data. For example, we've had a couple markets where they say, you know, the union stats data says that we have a really high unionization rate, but we don't have anyone who's union in our market. Having a slide, having something that gets ahead of those types of issues when the secondary data doesn't tell the whole story. Those last 2 points, again, and if there's kind of a theme here, it's using the data to tell stories. So as we said earlier in this conversation, no one's immune to having workforce problems. And I think it almost raises more eyebrows if we go to a market and they say everything's A-okay and you're going to be able to hire 500 production technicians tomorrow. No one believes that, and it's just not true. So as a result, what we often find and our clients find that's far more compelling is strategically lifting up, showing those challenges, but showing how the communities address those challenges and seeing how there's already results. Even if you haven't gotten all the way there, it's that type of, had a problem, we addressed it, we got everyone around the table, and we are seeing results now. And that gets into that final point of show, don't tell. Again, storytelling through your words, through your employer's words of telling this full story rather than just showing data.
Excellent. Those are excellent suggestions all around. And I wonder, we've got some really good questions pouring in here, specifically around this, but I wonder, Chris or Josh, if you could maybe do a little forecasting of what do you think the future of data visualization and that kind of storytelling will be. And I know it's obviously impossible to predict the future, but in general, like the trend, where do you see this trending? I ask that because I feel like there's more and more sources for being able to build infographics, maps like Tableau. You know, obviously Esri is used everywhere. And I also wonder if that, you know, in the vein of being authentic and honest, if there is also a sense of like, is it actually harmful to be overly glitzy or kind of fancy with graphics when it can maybe manipulate the data or not really tell the data story as clearly as could be if it's just a little more simple display.
Yeah, that's man. If I could tell the future on any of this stuff, I'd probably be sitting on a beach somewhere. But
yeah.
To your, that's a really, really good point. And I'll give my opinion on this is that there's a lot of data, there's a lot of tools, there's a way to manipulate data and do stuff on the fly, and there's some really neat stuff. And folks at economic development levels, even if they're not economists or labor market analysts or anything, can tell some really compelling stories using new methods, new data, new software, et cetera. But oftentimes it's it's simple line graphs. It's simple data points that show this is how the community's population is growing. Simple things that tell a compelling narrative. It's actually one of the points kind of on one of our wrap-up slides is I think a lot of communities can tell really compelling stories with 4 or 5 charts at the end of the day. So the ability to manipulate and do those types of really cool, innovative things is really important. And inevitably there's clients and companies who are looking for that. But you almost, again, I almost take like a Luddite view of, you almost want to go back to make it simple to tell a convincing and easy to understand story as it relates to just the simple things of demographics, key occupational presence, where people live, those types of things.
Great. And now maybe we can also hit on a little bit of how delivering that story as well.
Yep. So again, how we get information and to the next slide. I forget which Josh said it earlier, but again, data is as available as it's ever been. It's generally easy for most folks to find that, although I think we pine for the day when all site selectors will stop asking economic development agencies for their unemployment rate and their population of their county, of those types of simple things that folks should be able to find on their own. But that being aside, kind of two sources here of information: using your website to get information out there and responding to folks like us when we pick up the phone, give you a call and ask for some help. On the website side, selfishly, we'll say that we don't oftentimes use economic development websites to gather data. We oftentimes use it if it's a market that we haven't worked in a while, or we're looking for who to pick up the phone and give a call, and so forth. But we also understand that there's a lot of folks who do use websites in order to collect data, and use websites to basically to Google communities and to find that information quickly. So it's not just the website content, it's making sure that your search engine optimization is driving folks to, if you're Googling economic conditions in ABC County, that it's coming to your economic development website. But with that being said, having a good, clean website, modern, up-to-date, things are sourced. There's nothing worse from a data perspective is if you look at a website, it looks really nice, and then the footnote says data 2012 or data 2011 or press release. The most recent press release was 2014. So it's keeping that baseline data up to date, clean, easy to find. But we also, on that last bullet, using that data to tease all the other things that you as a community and a region can do. So by tease, we mean trying to get folks to pick up the phone and call, understanding that just grabbing the population statistics off your website, there's a lot more that you can do for companies or consultants who are looking at your community. So always good to make sure that everything is linked with have more questions, call John or call Sarah, that type of stuff. From an RFI response, I mean, we could have probably a full webinar on this, and everyone's got their certain system, and some folks use Word and some folks use Excel and some folks have online modules now and all sorts of stuff. So it's tough to say what is best. All we can say is, and Josh may have some other thoughts on this, we try to ask for the types of stuff that we need your help with gathering, things that don't exist on Emsi's Emsi Analyst, those things that don't exist on BLS or Census or Esri or anything like that. So that being said, complete RFI responses addresses the question, even if it's asking for your unemployment rate. And a couple of things we'll add to this is, where necessary, just annotating the data. Is if you want to lift up a recent kind of training program that your community college has launched, a short-term boot camp for machinists or something like that, effectively use your RFI response to annotate that, to add 2 lines about that, to add a couple lines about a recent closure or downsizing, just to give those a list, just a little bit more context and kind of tease it. We don't need the full press release on this program, but provide a little bit of context that, again, just kind of teases that information or gives that baseline stuff that goes beyond the numbers and beyond the data.
Great. Lots of gems in there. Chris, thanks much. I hope the audience has gotten lots of takeaways here. I've heard a bunch of things that have really resonated with me and in the communities that we work in as well. To conclude here, before we get to the Q&A, I'm hoping that both you, Chris, and Josh can give some final tips here for the audience in regards to, again, what kind of data that businesses want to see and how to present that data and tell a story. Yep,
and I'll go first here. And again, this is repeating some stuff that we've talked about, but that second to last and those last points are just a couple things I'll focus on for a moment. First is strategic candor. it's admitting your challenges, admitting your shortfalls, but showing how the community is addressing those workforce challenges going forward. No one's got it easy right now, and I find that those types of strategic storytelling does a better job than just trying to say that everything's great. The final thing is, and this goes back to one of the earlier points when I started talking about what folks are looking for. Positive demographics, where folks are living, what skill sets exist in a community, what the workforce pipeline and the educational institutions look for. I actually think that a lot of communities could do a really good kind of 4 or 5 slide simple summary of how you check those boxes favorably or where there are challenges. Wall Street Journal always has when they release the unemployment statistics or whatever, they've got the workforce report in 8 charts. I think every community can have a real easy and compelling story of our workforce story in 5 charts. And that's why we say don't be scared of the data. There's a lot of really cool stuff that Emsi does and we try to do and folks are doing, but oftentimes that can get lost. And telling a simple, compelling story in 3, 4, 5 charts or slides can actually go a lot further than all the advanced fancy stuff.
Yeah, from my perspective, knowing that when economic development has an opportunity to present workforce data to a company or consultant, just by nature of the site selection process, it's pretty far along in the process when primary research is becoming more and more important. I would encourage communities not to shoulder all of that burden themselves, or economic development agencies specifically, of shouldering all of the burden themselves of trying to tell that story, and try to incorporate all of your workforce partners in a balanced effort. That's everybody from existing employers to community and technical schools, to universities, to superintendents from the K through 12 platform, your staffing agencies, to that entire kind of ecosystem, and get them to help you tell that story, because if anything resonates with companies, it's that third party validation.
Great. So those are all great tips there. And we want to pivot now to the question and answer period. We've got a number of questions here from the audience we're going to get to. I've got one kind of just to tee it up for both of you. And this is going to be a tough question to answer probably, but there's been a lot of talk about, is the business cycle ending? Are we on the doorstep of perhaps another recession, or at least a slowing of the economy? And I wonder if that is indeed the case. Of course, all business cycles end at some point. How much of what we've talked about changes? I know we've focused a lot on workforce. If there is if there's more increasing slack in the labor market, I guess some of this perhaps changes, or how much of it changes versus how much of this is just, regardless of the environment, these are key things to really keep in mind.
Are you asking if we're shorting the market right now, whether we're getting our cash out? So one initial thought on that is that, yeah, business cycles are going to move. We might be at the peak or close to it here at some point. Who knows how steep the other side looks. That being said, I think there's a lot that comes from just baseline demographics and telling a long-term story about your community. Regardless of the business cycle, population growth, what your demographics look like are going to be really continually important, either in an up market or a down market. So understanding how to tell a company a story about that base of your workforce is going to remain to be important. The second thing I would say is just being in tune with your existing employers of when folks are still ramping up and when folks are steadying out, or when there's layoffs and so forth. And being on top of those types of opportunities is important in any market.
Yeah, it's funny. I follow the industrial sector a little bit more closely than anything, because Chris and I primarily work production and distribution projects. undoubtedly at some point in time, the economy is going to slow down. I think we're already starting to see some signs of that. We're starting to see some apprehension with projects that can be attributed to a lot of things: tariffs, political instability, rising just operating costs. I mean, there's a lot of things, but at some point in time, it's going to change. That being said, I still believe a lot of the themes that we discussed today are going to hold true, even if things do slow down, because I think the workforce is still going to be tight. It's still going to be just as tight. If you look at age pyramids and just age demographics and the aging of the U.S. workforce, even if it slows down, it's coming at a time where a substantial amount of the population is rolling out of the workforce. And so unless something, maybe I won't use the term catastrophic, but unless something drastic happens like we experienced in the Great Recession, which I don't think is going to happen, everything we talked about is still going to be relevant. It's not going to dip enough to where it really impacts workforce supply too terribly much.
Great, very insightful. And as we are talking here and answering questions, if you're in the audience, feel free to continue to add questions in the question box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can here. We still have a little bit more time here before our time is over. So I'm going to just start rattling through the questions that we've gotten. There's some really good ones here. And I'm going to put up our presenter slide as well, just so you have our contact information as well as we go forward here. The first question that I want to hit on, again, quite a few great ones here. Outside of cold calls to groups that do site selection, what are the best resources out there to determine the opportunities that are available?
My pause here is processing the question. So outside of just cold calling site selection firms, what are the best way to assess the opportunities and get in front of project activity? Is that essentially the question?
Yes, yeah, I think that's the question.
Chris, do you want me to take a stab at that, or do you want to?
You can go first, and then I have a couple thoughts as well.
My answer depends on what level of economic development that you operate in, right? And just knowing the flow of projects. For example, if you're a small community economic development, you're going to probably get a lot of project activity from regional and state and utility economic development, and I would certainly position yourself as such. But if you're talking about marketing to the broad site selection community, it's building relationships. And I hate that answer, and the reason I hate that answer is it implies that there's some magical list that you have to have a relationship to quote unquote get on that list, and that doesn't exist. Nothing could be further from the truth. But the reality is, when folks like us need to engage with economic development on the project, we have to know to pick up the phone and call. It's a lot easier when we've met that person before and that contact pops into our head. Now, I know that can be a costly endeavor, so you obviously try to piggyback with your partners, again, whether that's state, local, utility. I mean, for example, I'm going to dinner tonight with a state economic development group who's bringing several regional groups and a few local groups in tow. So there are ways to do that cost effectively, but it's building relationships. And to make that not sound so overwhelming of a task, site selection is kind of the 80-20 rule. I mean, 20% of the site selection community is doing 80% of projects. And so I think you can narrow that list down pretty quickly to get your arms around it.
Yep, I think Josh is spot on there especially for smaller communities, and we've seen some states and utilities do a better job of whether they're going to come make some calls to here in Dallas or Atlanta or Chicago and visit a bunch of folks, but having a team of a state person, a utility person, and a few communities, and especially those communities that may not have the opportunity to go do these types of trips, and those can be tremendously informative. The other thing I would add to what Josh said is, especially for smaller communities, and this sounds weird from a site selection consultant saying this, but it's knowing where there's those homegrown opportunities, of knowing your own industry, your own plant managers, your own operations folks, and so forth, to know when there's potentially the folks in your backyard are looking to expand, and there's maybe an opportunity for you to compete for that expansion versus expanding at another site. So it's having a really robust BR&E function to get ahead of those opportunities and know where they exist, which is kind of not site selection that we do, but is an opportunity for a lot of communities to grow their economic base.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point there about business retention and expansion, Chris, and great thoughts from Josh as well. That's a big question that we could spend a lot of time on. I know there's different vendors out there who are producing leads, or consultants who try to give communities leads for that type of thing, and the software that is being built around that as well. It's definitely a big question, but we've got quite a few other questions here to get to. One other one here is, how can we balance the local data, which more than likely is very positive, and that data that can be generated from outside independent partners or an independent partner? So how can you balance the local data, which you can be positive, it's data that maybe if I'm understanding the question correctly, maybe data that you can control a little bit as well, but positive local data with data that can be generated from an outside or independent source or independent partner.
So is it sort of that question in terms of whether you define it as secondary data from other sources and data that you're producing, or data that just exists from your community? And undoubtedly, it's a challenge to balance those. But I think it's really two things, and I think we touched on both of these. One is if there's data, secondary data or outside external data, that isn't as positive about your community, whether that's demographics or how many welders there are or whatever, it's getting out ahead of that when you're in front of a prospect and so forth, to say the data may show X, but based on what the resources we have and where the data lies, we actually have these resources. Here, talk to these employers that can speak to that, basically. The other side is you've got good data, positive data, and you've got a good story to tell. Have it triangulated, again, by, we're hitting on this point many, many times. We know that sometimes you can put the good employers in front of us, and sometimes the not as friendly employers in front of us and our clients. But it's hearing from those folks who, in some sense, have an incentive to not want more competition in a market, but to hear it from their voice to say, yeah, here are the positive aspects of this community and its workforce. Hearing that from employers, again, just resonates really, really, really strongly.
Fantastic. And piggybacking off that a little bit, we got another question of, how do we market ourselves if we have a weak workforce or underwhelming demographics?
So what was the first part of that? How do we market ourselves if
you have a weak workforce or a weak demographics, underwhelming demographics?
I mean, the term weak workforce is a pretty broad term that could be used to describe a lot of things. I mean, my initial reaction to that is, don't worry about marketing it, worry about product improvement, workforce being the product that you're improving. Chris, I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough in markets where there's just, whether it's population decline or just lack of skilled occupation types and skills in the workforce. That being said, I'd go back to that drawing board and say, what can you sell? If you don't have favorable demographics, is there an opportunity to show basically some slack? That there's not a whole bunch of Amazon's not coming. They're not going to hire thousands of people. Amazon DC is not coming. And look for those types of little wins and little opportunities. But to Josh's point on terms of product development, and product development both in terms of real estate, but product development on workforce, on training and education. If you've got challenges, that's where I would spend my money, is improving, doing everything you can to improve education and training resources in your community.
following up on that exact thing that you guys are hitting on in terms of product development, just got another question about that. Have you seen any good examples of product improvement of human capital, specifically programs to attract talent to non-metro areas?
Knew this question was going to come up on talent attraction and
right.
Man, I've got an opinion. Josh, what do you think?
No, let your opinion fly.
All right, so I'm gonna go with this, and I might step in it a little bit here. In terms of talent attraction, if it's the type of exercises that are talking about tax credits or paying folks or mortgage assistance to get folks to move to a community, I think there's potential some short-term opportunity there. And as we are in this really tight labor market and this divide between urban, suburban, and more rural areas, I can see why a lot of communities are attracted to, rural communities are attracted to doing something like that. I get really hesitant about the perception of a community that's saying, in one way or another, we are going to pay you to come to our town. I think it's potentially a little bit dangerous in that it sends a signal of no one wants to come here unless you pay them. And I know that's an extreme example, but that's what I would worry about with those types of schemes. Again, I'd go back to investing in the community in terms of education, training, even if you've got a small central business district, facade grants, making it a more attractive place to live, making more folks want to live there, investing that in public goods rather than in private goods of paying folks.
Yeah, I've got a positive and a negative about this. The positive is the good news about younger generations, or whether it's millennials or whatever we're classifying those younger than millennials as, is quality of life and place seems to influence them more than career opportunity. So when you look at things like talent attraction, they've all been centered around improving that quality of life. And I think that quality of life, that's going to resonate with today's generation a little bit more than it would have, say, 15, 20 years ago. The negative to that is when you talk about doing it outside of a metro area, that becomes more and more difficult unless there's some type of natural features or natural attributes about a community that makes it a little bit easier to do that. Regardless, it's an expensive and it's a long-term endeavor. That's something that you spend years working on. That's not a quick fix.
Yeah, this is another topic we could spend a lot of time on, and the topic that we've talked a lot with our clients about as well. Just one quick note about this: we released in November our 3rd annual talent attraction scorecard that ranks every county by how well they're doing in terms of migration and skilled job growth and things like that. And that broken into for smaller counties and large counties. And we have some strategies that we put in with that as well. This has been a big topic, talent attraction, obviously, the last few years as the labor market's gotten tighter. And I think that's a great point, what you both made in terms of the short-term gain that you can gain from some of those programs and the long-term perception issue that can come with those as well. And that's really excellent. We've got a couple other questions here as we get to the top of the hour. There are some Canadian economic development consultants on the webinar who have access to Emsi Canadian data or maybe other sources who consider themselves part of the North American site selection space. Any specific observations, recommendations, or suggestions relevant to them, to those Canadian economic developers?
Chris, you were born closest to Canada. You take that.
Well, as soon as we put up the wall on the northern border, it's going to be a moot point. But no, I mean, to be perfectly honest, we don't do a whole lot of work north of the border on the industrial side. From time to time, we'll have some projects that maybe due to agricultural resources or supply chain might make us look on the north side. But frankly, the vast majority of our corporate work is focused on the lower 48.
And it follows economic cycles. I mean, there was a time 8-9 years ago, around time of recession, pre-recession, where we were doing actually a fair amount of work in Canada. Our activity follows those economic cycles, but as Chris says, if we're ever spending much time evaluating or in Canada for site selection projects on the industrial side, it's because that particular client has a reason to be there from an inbound material perspective, or they're serving some population base in Canada. Those are typically the two biggies. Right now, from an operating cost perspective, unless one of those two things is the trump card, no pun intended there.
Right.
It's just the current economic cycle. We're just not spending a lot of time there.
Sure. A couple quick questions here about specific metrics, and then a broader question about climate change, actually. And I think these last few questions here. Number one, are community psychographics useful to include?
We don't use it in corporate site selection near as much as our counterparts in retail site selection use. But I also recognize that a lot of the responsibilities of economic development fall in retail attraction. I mean, that's where that's more prevalently used. You know, when segmentation data became in vogue in kind of the mid-aughts, there were a few firms, ourselves included, looked at how do you integrate that into corporate site selection. The reality was the correlations weren't strong enough to where it really enhanced our analyses very much. But I know that our counterparts on the retail side of site selection, the Buxtons of the world, if you will, would disagree vehemently with that.
Okay, great. And then secondly, are we hurting our story by reporting demographics and labor force data by drive time rather than radius from address? And is there a distinction there that should be made, or in terms of drive time versus radius from address?
I'm constantly surprised by some consultants who still insist on using a straight line radii, because in our view it just doesn't make any sense from a point, because you can't drive in a straight line to get to work through a river and a lake and a forest and all that stuff. I think using a reliable drive time radius, and by reliable, again, it can vary by state, but anytime it gets above 50, 55, 60 minutes, we start kind of doubting it a little bit, because those are pretty aggressive drive times. But I mean, drive time is how people actually live, as opposed to a big old circle around a site. So I know it shows lower numbers, but it's meaningless to us.
Yeah, I'd rather show lower numbers and get credibility by showing the right numbers.
Yeah, short and to the point there, absolutely. So last question we have here is about climate change. So I think it's a good question and interesting one to conclude on here. So for HQ2, Amazon asked about local sustainability initiatives, but not about response to climate change impacts, for instance, sea level rise, and then proceeded to locate in a moderately at-risk areas. Are site selection group clients starting to take metro resiliency into account in siting new operations or in thinking about headquarter relocations?
I think companies that are more susceptible to that are companies that are ultra consumer facing, and they're more worried about the public backlash from that. I mean, that's why I would suspect that was included in Amazon's, and we've had a bite out of that apple with more consumer facing companies that are more focused on sustainability and that sort of thing. Chris, what are your thoughts?
I mean, from the climate change question, I think you do, but again, it aligns with our industrial work, is that there's regardless of the climate change debate, there's challenges with locating in areas close to a coastline. So especially in the hurricane zone on the Atlantic and the Gulf Shore and so forth. And some projects are willing to deal with that risk, and some projects aren't willing to and are more happy to be 100, 200, 300 miles inland. So I certainly don't think that's something that gets taken into account, but much more from kind of a not a climate change perspective, but from a traditional natural disaster perspective.
Sure. Well, this has been a really interesting and I think thought-provoking discussion, hopefully helpful to all our audience. I know it's been certainly educational for me and for all our data-focused clients out there and people who are interested in these types of metrics. Chris and Josh, I want to thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the audience for all those great questions. Our contact information, again, is here if you have any specific questions offline. And I will note again that within 24 hours of the webinar, you should be receiving an evaluation will be emailed to you. And if you complete that evaluation, you'll receive a link to download the presentation. And that your evaluation is also very helpful to IEDC as they plan future webinars. Again, Chris and Josh, thank you very much, and thanks for attending. Hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.